wait till you click the record here, and then I'll get started.
There we go.
Perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your day to join us for the 5th session in our entrepreneurship workshop series with NFN. Today, we have Jason Williams from BDO Canada joining us to talk about taxation considerations for First Nation entrepreneurs. I personally think this is probably one of the most important bits of information that you're going to get in this session. Not everyone loves to talk about taxes. It's not a super fun, sexy topic, but it is unbelievably important. So for the sake of time, I'm going to let Jason get into it. So whenever you're ready, feel free to take it away.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, Vince. And good afternoon, everybody. As Vince said, Jason Williams, partner with BDO based out of Thunder Bay. And I kind of lead up our firm's Indigenous tax unit. So get involved with a lot of First Nations entrepreneurs, from all across Canada, and really enjoy it. Actually, I love helping people set up businesses and just trying to get that right. And as Vince said, tax is an important part of that, for sure. So. This is a presentation that, again, I did this I guess it was a couple of years ago now, so kind of going to go through the same thing. And if anyone has questions kind of as I'm going through, feel free to just kind of jump in and ask questions. We don't have to wait to the end. We can just kind of address those as we go through. So, as we said, tax, it is a really important consideration. It's not the only one, right? So, I mean, there's obviously, if you're setting up a business or if you're getting into business for the first time or expanding, there's lots of different things to consider. You've got legal liability, you got your financing, with your either banks or other sources or funding. You've got governance, how you operate your business. There's accounting issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of the times when we're just dealing with just general kind of entrepreneurs, taxation, it's important, it plays a part, but it's not really the main thing. But where we've got kind of Indigenous individuals or communities involved, then tax probably does become a bit more important of consideration, because if you get it right, you might be able to make your profits or run your business and pay no tax. And that's a huge advantage when you think about it, right? If you're competing against somebody that has to pay tax and you don't, that's going to give you a massive advantage over your competition, and obviously the ability to make a lot more money and to build up your own wealth quite substantially. So really important, I think, when we're dealing with First Nations individuals. And that being said, as I said here in my slide, tax exemptions don't automatically apply to First Nations or First Nation individuals, right? I mean, that's one of the fallacies. I know I hear it too. Oh, First Nation people, they don't pay tax, right? And it's like, well, no, that's not true, actually. A lot of them do, and a lot of them, there's no choice, you have to, but there are treaty and other tax rights that are available, but you have to structure yourself appropriately in order to take advantage of them. They're just not automatically there. So planning, hopefully at the beginning stages as you're kind of getting set up, but even down the road, becomes important, and really need to kind of look at that. So there's two primary areas of legislation here. One is the Indian Act itself, and that's mainly if you're looking at individuals. So individual entrepreneurs that are setting up businesses. There's income tax exemptions as well, but those mainly probably apply to actually like First Nations, tribal councils, that kind of thing. Okay, so Vince, as we were talking at the beginning, right, this is like every time it's just like there's so many different things to think about and so many different permutations, and really, it's because we've got like different taxes obviously to think about, right? You've got different types of businesses, the way that you're legally structured, and then you've got different owners, right? So there's all kinds of different combinations of things to think about, and each one, you really need to kind of look at and address and figure out, for yourself or your business, what's going to work. So for the taxes, obviously, we've got income tax. So that's, if you're going to make a profit, what is that look like? And is that subject to tax? We've got HST, GST, depending on which province you're in. So that's tax on, you buying goods and selling goods. You've got like personal taxes, like, on salary, maybe on investment income. You've got CPPEI. So, all of those things to think about. And then there's obviously, there's different ways to structure yourself, right? So you can be a sole proprietor, which means that you just carry on business in your own personal name, effectively, or as a partnership. So that's, two or more people coming together. So it could be like two individuals, or it could be an individual in a company, or an individual in a First Nation, or you incorporate. So, you set up a company, and that's now a separate legal entity that can be owned by First Nation individuals or First Nations. And then you look at, so that's, how you structure yourself, but then as it says there, that you look at your owner, who's actually owns this. Is it an Indigenous person? Is it a First Nation? Is it tribal council? Non-Indigenous person? So, lots of different things to look at on the spectrum there and to think about as you're kind of analyzing business opportunities and trying to figure out, okay, what things can I take advantage of from a taxation perspective? So Indian Act exemption. So again, this is going to be the one that is probably going to be the most important for individuals. So that's either, you're setting up as a sole proprietorship, you're just operating in your own name, or you're in partnership, or you're an employee, either of your own business or of somebody else's business, right? So it's the Indian Act exemption that comes into play. So Section 87 basically says, the following property is exempt from taxation. So that's one, the interest of an Indian or band in reserved lands or surrendered lands, right? And two, the personal property of an Indian or band situated on a reserve. Okay, now that's the key one right there. And again, that's the wording that's directly out of the Indian Act. So, there's been a lot of court cases over the years that have interpreted what that means, but importantly, personal property situated on a reserve, that includes income, right? Because it's not necessarily apparent off you're saying personal properties, like something that I can hold or whatever, but the courts have been really clear that that includes income, and therefore that's how it's possible to earn either employment income or business income. If it's on reserve, situated on reserve, then it's free of taxation. But part of the issue of dealing with the Indian Act is that it's old. I mean, that wording there predates Confederation, right? It's been around for a long time, and obviously, when the drafters were coming up with that, they didn't know how people are going to operate in the modern world, 200 years later, right? So there can be challenges in trying to figure out how it applies, because the connecting factors there. So it's really trying to say, okay, this is property, it's situated on reserve. What are the factors that connect that property to a reserve? And it's a very physical thing, right? Like it's very much looking at the land itself, and that's the actual reserve land, so not traditional territory. But the way people work today is a lot looser, right? So we're seeing some interesting things coming up in that regard. So just something to bear in mind. I said there are exemptions under the Income Tax Act as well, but those are primarily for First Nations and maybe tribal councils. And really the way that works in Canada is that all public bodies performing a function of government in Canada, and that's how it's defined in the Income Tax Act. So that's looking at provinces, municipalities, other government agencies within Canada. And CRA has now just basically said, okay, before you used to have to kind of submit a ruling to CRA to say, here's my First Nation, here's what it does. So, it does education, it does health, it does public works, it is functioning as a government, and used to have to apply to them to get them to sign off. But that's now kind of being done with, and CRA is basically, okay, look, if you're First Nation in Canada, then we'll just consider that you meet this definition and you're not subject to tax. So, but again, that's the Income Tax Act exemption that is more for communities and tribal councils themselves, not for individual entrepreneurs. Right. GST, HST. So I get a lot of questions from people saying, okay, I'm a status. How can I take advantage of my status when it comes to HST, GST? Is there things that I can do that are going to give me an advantage or something like that? And those are all really good questions, and I get them a lot. But unfortunately, the answer is generally no. GST, HST, if you're in business, it generally operates just the same as for anybody else. Doesn't matter whether or not your business is on reserve. Doesn't matter whether or not you are a status person as the owner of that business. Generally, HST, GST operates the same for every entrepreneur in Canada, really, and there's really no downside to that because I mean, from a business perspective, GST, HST is just kind of a flow through, right? It just kind of passes through your business. It's not a real cost to your business. Um, the primary issue with GST, HST is, how does it apply to your customer? So that's when it can become important, right? So if somebody's buying something from you, do you have to charge HST, GST to them? But again, from your own perspective, that doesn't make a difference on your own business, and there's no savings to be had there because you are located on reserve or off reserve, or anything like that from your business perspective. So just kind of had a real quick example, just kind of show, the flow through nature of it. So, you go and buy some goods from supplier. So $70, they charge you 13% HST in Ontario. So you pay them 79. You then sell that to your customer for 100. You have to charge them 13 of HST. So you've invoiced them 113. The HST that you pay out and the HST that you collect, you just kind of put those together. So that's the 9 that you pay out, the 13 that you collect. So you've ended up collecting a net of 4. You just hand that back to the government and you're left with your profits at 30, which would have been the exact same thing had you just bought your goods for 70 and sold them for 100 without having to operate HST or GST. So, again, it's just, from your business perspective, it really doesn't make a difference. So the only advantage would be sometimes, depending on what you're selling, if you're on reserve, then for your customer's sake, that could mean that you can sell it to them without having to collect the HST from them. Won't make a difference to your profits, but could make a difference for your customers. Okay, so one of the key questions, again, should I incorporate my new business? So this is probably one of the most common ones that we get from a lot of people that we work with. And obviously, it's a really important issue to consider. So from a taxation perspective, corporations owned by First Nation individuals are not exempt from tax, right? So the only corporations that are exempt from tax are ones that are owned by First Nations themselves, not by First Nation individuals. So the Indian Act does not apply to companies. It only applies to individuals and First Nations. So that's the first thing to note is that, okay, default position is that company could be subject to tax, right? There's no exemption just because it happens to be owned by a First Nation individual. Another important thing to note is that salaries can be paid tax exempt to individuals, right? So that depends on where the work is, and we'll have a look at what that looks like in terms of salaries in a couple of slides. You want to start thinking about things like, okay, where is the work undertaken? Where are my customers? Am I actually going to be able to work on a reserve somewhere some of the time, part of the time? Start exploring those things just to see, off the face of it, okay, is there some way that we can take advantage of some of the tax exemptions that are available under the Indian Act for you personally? Also, a lot of non-tax issues to consider if you're looking at incorporating. Like one of the key drivers for a lot of people when they incorporate is legal liability. Obviously, if you carry on business either personally or through a partnership, then your own personal assets are potentially subject to risk. If something goes wrong and your business gets sued, it's really you that's getting sued personally, right? Whereas if you set up a company, that sets up a barrier between you personally, your personal assets, and the company and its assets. So that's usually one of the key kind of drivers that a lot of people start saying, okay, should I incorporate or not? I'm worried that if I get sued here, I don't want to lose my house, that kind of thing. Financing, security as well. A lot of times banks are used to dealing with certain types of organizations like companies and things like that. So sometimes that makes it a bit easier. But you got to think about, cost to administer. If you set up a company, that's now a separate taxpayer. It's got to file tax returns. It's got to pay tax if we have to pay tax. So that comes with additional cost and complexity as well, if you're going to be looking at that. Sole proprietor or partnership. So that's kind of like the default position, I guess, right? It's like the simplest thing to do, right? Like you could just say, okay, I've got an idea, I've got a business idea, I'm just going to start selling now, right? I'm going to start operating, and it's easiest just to start doing it in your own name. Now, what we're looking at here in terms of, so this comes back to the Indian Act exemption, right? So, okay, so you start a business, you're just doing it personally, and you're saying, you're going to come to me and say, okay, do I have to pay tax on that? If I make a profit of $50,000 doing this, am I going to have to pay tax on that? And this is now going to come back to that Indian Act exemption and looking at, okay, what are the connecting factors? Is there enough in how you operate, where you're doing it, that we can say, standing back and looking at it saying, okay, there's enough here to connect that activity to a reserve or reserves, and therefore we think it's exempt under the Indian Act, right? So we're going to start looking at things like, okay, where are you actually working? Where are you physically working? Do you have an office on reserve? Often, if you don't, the advice is probably, well, you should probably get one, or at least try and get one. I know that's not always possible. It's easier depending, like here in Thunder Bay, we've got Fort William First Nation. I mean, it's basically part of the city of Thunder Bay, right? So it's just right here. It's easy to kind of get there. Actually, yeah, we'll get to you in just a second, Cameron. I'm just going to get through this list here. Where do you live? Like, do you live on a reserve or off a reserve? Where are your customers located? Where do you keep your books and records? Where are business decision made? It's all of these things. You start pulling together a picture, and quite often I'll sit down with people that are looking at this and saying, okay, let's start going through each of these and just see, what are you thinking in terms of your default position, and where are the flexibilities? Where do you think you can move, and what things do you think that you could do? And again, it's trying to push as much as we can into that. Yes, this is tied to a reserve, and therefore we're getting more comfortable on the fact that this income could be exempt from taxation. So, Cameron, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. One of the things that we're facing here at the nation that's a sort of limitation on what we can do is a lack of sort of ready-made office space.
Mhm.
Right? We've developed one small business center that's full.
Yep.
And one of the solutions that we've tossed around internally is the creation of sort of virtual offices. And I wonder if you've had any experience with that and how that may or may not help us to provide at least a kind of this connecting factor for the members here on reserve.
Yeah, so you mean a virtual office as in like somebody still sits at home, not on reserve, but kind of.
Yeah, I guess what we were thinking is that I guess there's some examples where it's like a virtual office. It doesn't exist, but there's like an address. There's no physical space, but there's an address that's registered here.
Mm-hmm.
I guess some other nations have tried to do that, but I don't know if it's successful or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably not right now. Like, I mean, I know what you're saying, and because there are space constraints at Fort William here in Thunder Bay as well. So it's an issue, right? And the way the courts have looked at this, and I know CRA would interpret it the same way, it's very much a physical based thing, right? When they say where are you working, that means literally where are your feet? Are they touching the ground on land that is registered as reserve land or not? Unfortunately, that's kind of the real thing that it's going. And we have had challenges from CRA, and they, when they say, you're working on a reserve, like they'll actually go and, like, if I had them go out and like visit the proposed office space and talk to people around. It's like, okay, this guy says he works here. Have you ever seen him? Do you know who this? Do you know who this is? Right? Like, is this a real thing? So, unfortunately, like you said, because of the way that the legislation is set up in the old language, it is very much still just a physically, are you actually there when you're working?
That's great, Miigwech.
Right. Yeah. So again, all of those, connecting factors, and part of it is saying, okay, can we get the facts kind of lined up in the right way so this makes sense, that we're getting comfortable, and part of it is being able to prove it too, right? Because there's nothing stopping CRA, say, coming back in 3 years' time and saying, okay, we realize that you've made all of this money, you haven't paid any tax on us, prove to us that you're entitled to this exemption. And so I mean, I'll even get down to practical things with some clients, saying, okay, if we're going to go down this road, and then when you go onto the reserve in the morning, go buy a cup of coffee with your credit card. And that sounds stupid, but I mean, that's good evidence that you had to have been there, right? At least you were physically there, and things like that, right? So and keeping logs of where you work and where you spend your time, and you're really trying to get to a position that if CRA ever does come back and challenge it, you've got your paperwork in order, right? And it's one of those ones. It's hopefully easy to kind of get them to go away, because they realize, okay, this is a person that knows what they're doing. They're not just taking a chance and saying, I'm on reserve, when I've never actually been there, and claiming the exemption, and hopefully get them to go and look at somebody else rather than you. So that's kind of the analysis there. It's unless you are, a lot of the times that these areas are gray, right? It's like sometimes it's really straightforward. This person says, I've secured office on reserve next to, near to where I live, and I'm going to be there 5 days a week, and genuinely they're going to be there 5 days a week. So in that case, we're pretty confident that that is exempt income. But a lot of the times it is a bit more kind of dynamic in terms of, I've got an office, but I'm not going to be there all the time. Sometimes I'm going to work from home. Sometimes I'll be, I've got to go to Toronto maybe, a month, a year. So, in those cases, then it becomes a bit, you just have to look at it a bit closer and try to get to the point where we could say, okay, yes, we're comfortable, all of it exempt. And sometimes you make it to the point saying, you know what, we could probably demonstrate that at least half of your income is exempt. So half of it might be and half of it might not be, right? So sometimes you end up kind of in a middle position saying, okay, we're going to claim the exemption on some of the income, but not necessarily all of it, because to try and claim it on all of it would be, pushing it a bit too far, and leaves you as an owner a bit exposed, right? The last thing that you want to happen, and this has happened, is, you get 5 years down the road, CRA comes back and reassesses, and suddenly you owe them 150 grand and you don't have the money, right? And people have gone bankrupt. So it's something you got to take very, very seriously, if you are going down that road. So, a lot of the times it's just, okay, what can we get really comfortable with, that yes, if CRA comes, we can answer it, we've got a strong case, and we can put it before them. But again, operating as a sole proprietorship, but if you do that, then personal liability could be an issue. So you have to look at that, take legal advice, and it will depend on what type of business you're into, and what you think the risks are associated with that as well. And as we said, GST, HST will operate as normal. If you are an individual, you will have to register, get a business number from CRA and apply for, an HST, GST account, and maybe a payroll account as well. But that's a relatively straightforward process to go through there. So corporations. So as I said before, corporations are not tax exempt under the Indian Act if they're owned by individuals. So, okay, what do we do then? So a lot of the times it is, okay, for either financing or liability reasons, it's important. I really should incorporate, right? That becomes something that's really important. So what we often do in that situation is we could still potentially get to the end where you'll pay no tax on the profits of it, but there's just a few more steps to kind of to go through, and really, and again, you still need to have those factors connecting your work to a reserve. But what we usually do is say, okay, just say we're going to incorporate. You're the owner, so you're the 100% shareholder of new company that you set up. So let's just say you made a profit of 100 in the year, right? And then what we would do is say, okay, we're going to pay out a bonus or salary to you as the owner of 100. And so basically that means that wipes out all of the taxable profit of the company, right? You don't physically have to take the money out, but you were basically saying, okay, we're going to pay you as the owner a bonus. So no tax in the company. And then if we can get to the point where we're comfortable saying, that bonus was earned on reserve, then looking at the similar connecting factors that we looked at for the sole proprietorship, then, we can say, okay, Indian Act should apply to that bonus it's received and there's no tax. So that's kind of the common planning that we'll go through if you said, okay, I do need to incorporate for these other reasons. How can we do it and structure it so that I still don't pay tax? So that's kind of the analysis that we go through there. I'm trying to, Vince, was there a question that came in?
Yes, there was. I always forget that on Teams it's a bit hard to see the chat and present at the same time. So Evelyn says she runs a film production company on the reserve established last year. She has some questions specific to the entertainment industry. Is there a good time to ask questions? I mean, I feel like now is the time. Evelyn, if you wanted to unmute yourself and ask, or if you wanted to throw them in the chat, either way works.
Yeah. I think. Well,
hi, Jason.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah. Basically, obviously, because I have had to incorporate, obviously, as you're mentioning, it is a taxable entity, and there's a bunch of different things. I'm really appreciating this specific slide here as an example of ways of dealing with that. But, we're kind of looking very specifically for things like, I don't know, do you want to narrow down specifically what question you want to start with here?
I think I'll speak for Evelyn, Jason. Evelyn's the creative and I'm more of the administrative.
Yeah.
Good combination.
This is a mother-daughter team in Nipissing First Nation. So as artists, Evelyn gets grants from the Indigenous Screen Office and the Canada Council of the Arts.
Yeah.
And it's for filmmaking. So they're fairly large amounts. The film we're making this summer is a $500,000 budget. Part of the money was funded to Evelyn through the necessity of a corporation. That's the ISO, you have to be incorporated. But the Canada Council is just private, like federal monies that Evelyn can be a sole proprietor with those monies. And there seems to be a shortage of Indigenous entertainment accountants, Indigenous
Entertainment
lawyers and tax specialists. So we're trying to do this so that the Indigenous, we prioritize hiring Indigenous peoples on our productions if we can get them. Some of them are from our First Nations, some of them are from other First Nations, and some of them are American filmmakers. We have a cinematographer and a co-director coming up from Navajo First Nation and Blackfeet. So obviously, we're trying to do this in a way that benefits all of our Indigenous employees, and so also that they're not penalized for working with us somewhere down the line, like you say, 3 or 5 years later. Somebody just shows up and says, you know what, you owe us $5,000 or $15,000, that sort of a thing. So these are big questions. So we have a whole bunch of questions with someone with your knowledge, but we're wondering, can you recommend us an entertainment lawyer, an entertainment accountant, a tax accountant that can help us find our way through this the first time correctly, Because Evelyn has a sole proprietorship. She's been getting these grants for 5 years. She is tax exempt. We live and work on the reserve.
Yeah. That's pretty clear then.
Yeah.
So okay.
Well, with the corporation, everything shifted, and the film itself, which is a separate corporation, because each film we make has its own corporation,
Its
like
own
a
sole purpose, yeah.
subsidiary. So we're just wondering how to do this right the first time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me have a think about that. I haven't dealt specifically in that industry myself.
Okay.
But obviously, there's a lot of people around. I think probably the First Nation aspect of it I don't think it really makes a difference what industry it's in, right? Like, I mean, you analyze the facts, and it's the knowledge of the Indian Act that's important there, not necessarily anything else. So I think I'd be comfortable myself from a tax perspective being able to do that. But yeah, why don't you'll come to the last slide here. I'll have my contact details. So why don't you can fire me an email after, and then we can kind of connect afterwards and see if we can kind of point you in the right direction. But yeah, that sounds great. Sounds really, really interesting.
Thanks so much, Jason.
Yeah, not a problem.
Definitely a lot of layers to juggle.
Oh yeah.
I'm thinking as
Exactly.
like a business advisor, and just thinking of all the, you have to deal with 2 different countries, governments, plus individuals of status and potentially not of status. And oh man,
Yeah, exactly.
definitely it's
Yeah.
good that you're gonna talk with someone at an accounting firm to figure that out for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. You say, yeah, there's lots of things to think about there. Very interesting though. Very, very cool. Righty then. Okay, so tax on employment income. So, and again, this is for any employee. So, in the example before, we're saying, okay, maybe it's just you that is the owner and you're paying yourself a salary, but this would apply to any employee. So, again, we're back to those connecting factors. Where do you work? Where do you perform your work? Where is your employer located or resident? Where do you live as an individual? And, again, it's all of those. Okay, which one of these connect this employment income, which is, the personal property, to a reserve, and therefore can we get comfortable that yes, Section 87 is going to kick in, and you can earn that employment income without having to pay tax on it. Now, and again, it's a question of fact. It's sometimes you just have those slam dunk cases. Yes, for sure. You're working on a Tim Hortons on reserve. You're there. You're not working anywhere else. It's obvious, right? But a lot of the times there are gray areas and things that are a bit uncertain, and you got to sit down and kind of really work through them. Now, in this case here, the risk is really being taken on by the employee, right? So if something goes wrong, and we have seen this, it's the employee that they're going to come after. So, if you have an employee that is working for you, you're not withholding tax, and then something goes wrong, CRA comes in and audits them and finds that no, they should have paid tax, they're going to go after the employee for that, right? For the money. It's their liability. The employer potentially could be on the hook for some penalties, but the actual tax itself is they're going to come after the employee. So now CRA, they've developed some guidelines. These been probably around for, I don't know, 25, 30 years or something like that. And they're not the law, but as ever, whenever a government puts out, okay, here's our kind of guidelines, if you can fall within them, well, that's a good place to start, right? Because at least that's your first goal. Okay, let's see if we can just fall within the guidelines, because if you are, chances are it's going to be okay. And there's 4 guidelines. So one is that if 90% of your employees if your duties of employment take place on a reserve, then CRA say, okay, it's all exempt. The entire thing is exempt. If your employer is resident on reserve and the employee lives on reserve, then CRA would say, okay, yeah, totally exempt. There's enough connecting factors to your life and what you're doing there to make it totally exempt. Now, resident on a reserve, so employer resident on a reserve, and employee lives on a reserve. And this is coming back to Cameron's point earlier. That is like really resident on reserve and really lives on reserve, not just a post office box kind of thing, right? If half or 50% or more of your duties actually physically take place on reserve, and the employer is resident there, or you live on reserve, then, and again, CRA would say, okay, there's enough connecting factors there just in that basic fact pattern that all of that employment income is going to be exempt from tax. And even if you don't fall within one of those, let's just say 60% of your employment duties take place on reserve, but you're just working for a company that's not on reserve and you don't live on reserve, then they'd say, okay, we can prorate then. So we'll say 60% of the time on reserve, 60% of your employment income is exempt, and the 40% it will be taxable. So and quite often you'll see people will fill out these forms TD1IN. And that's basically just the employee kind of signing off and saying, yes, I should be exempt because of one of these conditions. And it's really to try and protect the employer, right? Because what's going to happen in that situation is they're going to start paying your salary, every 2 weeks or twice a month or whatever it is, and they're not going to withhold any tax on it. And that sign off is if CRA comes back and saying, well, why did you do that? And say, well, the employee told me that they were exempt and therefore I didn't withhold tax. And that's the reason why that happened. So that's kind of the key things to think about when it comes to tax on employment income. And again, lots of interesting discussions around this. So how can we manage this? How can we do that? And sometimes I'll talk with businesses or organizations that saying, okay, we're not on reserve right now. We're thinking about moving on reserve. Our head office, what does that mean? What are the implications for our employees? All of that kind of stuff. So yeah, anyways, a lot of really kind of interesting things around that area, but certainly important, for you personally as a business owner, especially if you incorporate, because you have to think about this for yourself personally. But it becomes a really important thing for your employees too, right? And can put your business in a competitive advantage if you can say, okay, we can offer employment, and if it takes place under these conditions, then we can pay you tax-free, which certainly could be an advantage in comparison to some of the other employers that are out there. So, Cameron, got your hand up again?
Yeah, thanks. Sometimes I get a question about, and I'm even thinking about my own wife who has a business here, like a consulting business that she runs out of our home. The question I have is about other sources of income. So what about things like revenue from investments that are in her name, or like she's about to take on some schooling and there's a kind of, what do you call this, like a bursary or whatever associated with that. I wonder how that's going to impact her. Does she need to pay tax on that stuff?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, when you're looking at investment income, and there's been some cases that have come down, maybe, I don't know, they're probably about 10 years ago now, that the way the courts, I think, would look at it now is that pretty much most just regular investment income. So if you've got stocks and bonds and all of that kind of stuff, the Indian Act would not apply to those, right? What they would probably say is like, okay, in order for the Indian Act exemption to apply, what you're basically looking at is, say, like a GIC, something really just interest bearing only, that is taken out at an on-reserve branch of a financial institution.
Okay.
So that it's really, that's probably where, as far as you'd be able to push CRA these days, and saying, that any investment income would be exempt from tax.
Thank you.
I guess that makes sense, because if you're investing in a publicly traded company, the way they would probably see it, I guess, legally, obviously I'm not a lawyer, I can't assume this, but it's because the revenue activity is being generated in that publicly traded company,
Exactly.
and it's not on a reserve.
That's the understanding I've had.
Yeah.
I've looked into it myself as well, and they said if the instrument you're using to invest is earned off of the reserve, it wouldn't be exempt of tax. So essentially, you'd have to invest in a company that only operates on the reserve and purchase shares of that company if that were to exist. But I've looked into that as well too, because yeah, that'd be very beneficial.
Right.
Yeah, no, for sure, right? Like, I mean, that would make a big difference, right? So, I mean, over the last few years, that's probably left most people. It's like, what, I'm going to get a 0.5% on a GIC. Like, why even bother, right? Like, who cares? But, maybe it changes a little bit. You can probably get a 5% GIC now. And if your options are, okay, I could take that out on an on reserve, on reserve branch of a financial institution, well, then maybe that's worth looking at, right? But yeah, certainly anything beyond that. And I think you're right, Zach. I mean, it's kind of like saying, okay, well, okay, even if you take it out on an on reserve branch, like as soon as that money is invested, like it's just in, it's in Apple and Google and all kinds of, it has nothing, there's really nothing connecting that to a reserve, right? So. And so there's my contact details. I guess, Evelyn, if you want to kind of shoot me an email, you can have a chat about your specific situation. But yeah, that's what I had for now. So I'm not sure if there's any other questions from anybody else in the meantime.
Yeah, if there's any other questions for Jason while we have them, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask away or throw them in the chat. I'll give a little bit of time in case anyone is typing. Oh, another question, Evelyn. Feel free.
Hi.
It's just a real simple, probably obvious question, but because the film budget is over $500,000, we're obliged to get a register for HST, right?
For sure, I would assume, because if it counts as like traditional revenue, anything over $30,000 at that point, you gotta make sure.
It's not profit. That's what I'm saying. It won't necessarily be profit to Rockwood Media because
it's 30,000 in revenue, to my knowledge.
It's just revenue. It's not profit. Okay.
Yeah, and so like some industries get kind of screwed over like that. Like I've got a lot of clients who are contractors who, a lot of their invoices is technically paying for the materials, but at the end of the day, the invoice total is revenue. So they have to register usually earlier for HST than a lot of my other clients do.
Yeah. And a lot of the times, I think we'd probably recommend that you just register anyways.
Yeah.
The thing is, what you do if you're registered, that means if you're buying things and you have to pay HST on it, then you get to recover that, right? You get it back.
That's awesome.
So it's probably worth registering anyways, and like Vince said, probably the sooner the better.
Yeah.
But as you explained earlier, like if we charge if we buy a book and we pay $4 in HST and we sell the book and we get $4 back, like, isn't it just a lot of extra paperwork to be where we were in the first place?
It is extra paperwork, but
there's no profit
unfortunately
involved. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you're not better off or worse off because the fact that you're on reserve, that doesn't make a difference, but you do have to do it. So
all right.
Yeah.
That's that.
That's the key thing. I don't want you to go to jail, and
No,
the government of Canada, they do take that very seriously because they, when it comes to HST,
Yeah.
that's when they really clamp down on.
Well, I really like this the slide that you shared with us just about paying the bonus in a way of kind of lessening your tax burden by issuing a bonus to the owner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. And most of the time that works. I mean, I guess the one caveat there, Zach, about that would be like CRA could come back and say, okay, you made $1 million, you paid a bonus $1 million, right? Because that and let's just say everybody's like, okay, that was earned on reserve, so there's no tax on that income, right, for the individual. They could come back and say, okay, well, prove to us that $1 million is actually like fair market compensation to that individual for what they had done, right?
Right.
That's the only thing that CRA, they could come back and challenge that, right? Like for most, like for if a person is taxable, like let's say if I owned a company and I made $1 million and paid myself $1 million, CRA wouldn't care, right? Because
right.
I pay tax on $1 million, so who cares? Doesn't make a difference. But if it's going to a tax exempt individual, they can, in theory, come and say, okay, prove to us that is, you would have paid somebody else that much money to do what they had done.
Right,
now,
for that work.
Yeah. Now, I mean, if it's just you or you're the main person generating that income, well, I mean, it's like, okay, well,
Yeah, I
how
picked.
could it not? How could it not be? You know, so as long as you don't kind of get kind of goofy and start manipulating thing, I think there was a case a while ago where, you know, it was a husband and wife. And I think the husband was the main kind of, you know, it was his business, right? He was the main person behind it, and the wife did the bookkeeping, right? Really important service, but he was not status, but she was. And you know, he took a salary of like 50 grand, and she took like $1 million bonus, and yeah,
Right.
that didn't go over well.
Definitely something to keep in mind then.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we have some members that would fall into that situation as well, right? A lot of the time that does happen. One of the significant others does the bookkeeping, the other runs the business, and we see that often. So
Yep, for sure. Yeah.
well, miigwech for that. That was very, very informative.
Welcome.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jason. We appreciate your time.
Okay.
So yeah, Jason's graciously put his contact information here. So if there was a question that you wanted to send his way, then definitely make sure you grab that information now. And I think that's where we'll call it for Jason's presentation. So feel free to have a great rest of your day, and we will get started just talking about general business structure, intellectual property, and kind of business regulations for the back half of this presentation. I won't take up too much of your time with it, but it is still good, important considerations to go over.
All right. Okay, I'm gonna sign off then, Vince. Thank you very much. And
sounds good.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Again, Jason.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Okay.
Jason.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay, let's make sure my PowerPoint is open here. And we will open the share tray. Okay, let me know when you guys can see this. Yep, you can see it? It's full screen?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, awesome. All right. So like I just said, we're going to get into kind of going over different types of business structure, regulations to consider, as well as intellectual property. So, I mean, the most important thing in regards to me discussing business structure with you is something that Jason touched on as well, is the fact that if you were to go through that incorporation route, which is creating a separate legal entity from yourself, you can't have it be of Indigenous status because it is its own entity. So that's kind of why we were getting into the conversation of, you know, giving a bonus to the individual of Indigenous status as, you know, a form of not having to pay business taxes. So that's kind of the main consideration. So only consider incorporating if it is relevant to the situation of your business or the nature of the business. But most likely, a lot of your businesses are probably going to be structured as sole proprietorships or partnerships, which of course are tied to you as individuals, which means they can be of Indigenous status because they are part of the individual, at least in the eyes of the government. So a sole proprietorship is basically just the term to define a business that is owned by one sole owner or operator. So that means all the profits of the business are applied to the personal revenue of the owner or the household income of the owner. This is a dated slide. It says a master business license, but it's not what it's called anymore. It's just called a business name registration. But a business name registration is required to create a sole proprietorship, and that allows you to have a different operating name from just your first name and your last name. So for example, I don't have to actually get a business registration of any kind if I was just going to operate as Vincent Galea. And that's perfectly okay. There's a lot of businesses that do that based on the nature of what they do. So I used to do like DoorDash deliveries as a form of side revenue, and I never registered that business. I just did it under the name Vincent Galea sole proprietor when I was doing my taxes or my T2125 at the end of the year. So I never actually had to go through that process. But say I started like a consulting company and I wanted to call it Galea Consulting, which I just realized that's actually the name of my dad's company, which is incorporated, so I couldn't use that name. I would have to have a different name. But regardless, to do that, I would have to actually register that name, and it costs $60 every 5 years to register the name to your sole proprietorship. And in this form of business structure, all the business liability does fall directly on the owner. It is tied to the owner. So that is one of the benefits from a legal perspective as to why people consider incorporating, because there is that legal separation when it comes to a liability perspective. So partnerships are another way to look at registering your business. It's basically a sole proprietorship that is split between more than one owner. So in terms of how it's actually structured, there's basically not a lot of differences between a partnership and a sole proprietorship, other than the fact that the ownership is split in some capacity. So they can be either general partnerships or limited partnerships. So a general partnership is when things are evenly split. So that's 50-50, 33-33, 33, 25-25, 25, however you decide to split it. I just did a 5-way partnership the other day. I'm not good at math, so I'm not going to keep going forward with whatever that ratio would be, but basically they are all splitting it 5 ways. But because of that, when it comes to their household taxes and doing their T2125s, which they would each be doing, and keeping them identical between everyone who's a part owner's business, all their tax forms are going to look the same at the end of the year. And then they will actually just split the taxable portion of the profits between however many owners there are. Limited partnerships, on the other hand, are split based on basically like the amount of assets or capital they've contributed. It can be changed between, say my brother and I choose to get into a business together, which I never recommend doing. Be very careful getting into business with family, unless it's family that you can work really well in, because I've seen some not so great scenarios where, oh yeah, we're family, we can definitely have a business together, and then it ends up not being a great working relationship. But if, say, I contributed X amount of money to help start a business, and then my brother contributed a lesser amount, so then I was like, okay, I'm going to take 60% of the business and my brother will take 40. In order to structure that, it's a bit harder of a process to register. So usually that requires consulting with an accountant or a lawyer to make sure that the agreement basically states who owns what the contributions mean, what the percentage split is, what are the responsibilities of each individual. And on that same note, if you're getting legal counsel of any kind, most partnerships should definitely consult a lawyer to draft up a partnership agreement, because you never know, like I said, with working relationships, they can go south once there's like a ending of that honeymoon phase. I've had, in my 5.5 years here, some pretty funny stories when it comes to partnerships that were definitely perfectly fine and everyone seemed super amicable at the start, and then things turned for the worse. And honestly, splitting up a partnership once it's had revenue and assets and stuff contributed to it is messier than a divorce, if I'm going to be honest with you. So that's one thing to consider if you're looking at the partnership route. So back on the corporation aspect. So this, like I said earlier, is separating the business and creating a legal entity that is not related to the business owner. So then the owners of the business become shareholders or employees to the business. This is however you choose to structure it. You can have a corporation that's owned by just one person. So one person can have 100% of shares. That's perfectly fine. There are more tax filings and regulatory filings that are involved in corporate taxes. So then that increased fee can make having a corporation more costly. But we also have a flat corporate tax rate in Canada, as opposed to the fluctuating personal tax rate of just traditional income. So there is a point for some individuals, if you say the income you end up generating hypothetically is off reserve, so you know it's all going to be taxable, it might be worth then to look at incorporating if the profits are over like $50,000-$60,000 for the year, because it might be actually more cost effective than having that $60,000 just applied to your household income based on whatever the tax rate ends up being. Obviously, I'm speaking in very vague terms. There's a lot of different complex tax scenarios that can happen, especially when it comes to dealing with businesses that are on reserve. So then everyone's situation is different, so it might be worth consulting with an actual accountant who is comfortable with like Indigenous taxes. So that decrease of direct liability is also another benefit that people look at when it comes to a corporation. Splitting that separate legal entity status can help based on the nature of the business. If your business has something that has a lot of potential liability risks, it might be worth incorporating just to have that separation if you think that you would be involved in a potential lawsuit that could cause issues with your business, and then it would be the corporation that's involved in that lawsuit and not you as an individual. So the Ontario Business Registry is actually how businesses can be like registered and incorporated these days. It's something they started in October of 2021, and it's actually relatively straightforward in comparison to what it used to be. So you can register as a sole proprietorship, partnership, or incorporate through this platform. There's actually, I don't have a slide for it, but there's another licensed third-party platform that, in my opinion, is even easier than using the Service Ontario Business Registry, and that's called Owner, OWNR. And they are a licensed third-party provider that also can help with these services, and they have very competitive pricing. Like the registration costs on Owner is actually, I don't know how they're doing it. I feel like they're taking a loss on it, but it's cheaper than the government price to register for a sole proprietorship or a partnership. But their corporations do cost more money to do through them, but to be honest, make the process easier. So if you're not good with technology, it might be worth going to them as opposed to trying to figure it out through the business registry. But regardless, if anyone is getting to that step and needs help, feel free to let me know, please. I do this every day. I've got 2 meetings literally right after this to help people incorporate their businesses, so it doesn't take that long at all. So some regulations that might come about based on the type of business that you're doing, there might be like additional regulations beyond just registering the business. Obviously, if you're operating on NFN land, then you have to have an NFN business license. So that's something that you would definitely want to be in touch with Zach about if you're, haven't considered that yet. I'm assuming most of you at this point would probably have a general idea if you've been communicating with Zach or with the office. But also, if you have employees, then you'll definitely have to follow proper CRA regulations when it comes to like preparing their T4s, as well as deducting income tax, CPP, EI, and paying their vacation pay. So all like the provincial regulations. But again, if the staff or the CRA, if the employees are of Indigenous status, then there might be things like, not having to take off income tax if the employee is on reserve and the activities of them generating revenue are also on reserve. Then that might be something that doesn't have to be considered, but I would definitely be in touch with an accountant to figure out the logistics behind that. If you have employees, you'll need to have an account with WSIB. I wrote this slide not considering if I was presenting it to people on reserve or not, but I know that Cameron actually let me know that you don't need to have WSIB, but you can choose to opt into it if you think it would help your business and allow you to be more competitive based on the nature of the business. This is for the employees that would be on reserve. If they are off reserve and you are hiring them, then you would definitely have to have WSIB for them. Some industries will have more regulations, like specifically about the business activities, but these would usually be like codified laws. So like say you were doing something related to healthcare or something that required a specific certification. Most likely, if you got an education in that certification, you would probably, just by the nature of how you operate, like say you were starting a nursing business, you would most likely know the best practices when it comes to providing like nursing care, for example. But you can look up specific laws related to your industry if your industry is one of those that would be regulated by the laws or bills that have been passed by the government. So municipal licensing, this is like if you were to be operating a business in North Bay, for example, which is where I'm located, there are some businesses such as restaurants or pawn shops or pet stores or food trucks that require a municipal license on top of just having their provincial business license, either as a sole proprietorship or a corporation or a partnership. Usually these are yearly and have like a fee associated with them, and also have some requirements with the municipal office that you're working with. This would be also something to consider when it comes to registering your business with NFN. So do make sure that you are familiar and comfortable with the licensing process, which again, make sure you're in touch with Zach if you do have any questions regarding that. In terms of zoning, based on whatever municipality you decide to operate in, it is good to also consider if the type of work that you're doing on the property that you're doing it on is zoned accordingly based on the classifications of the zoning department. If there is a zoning department, or city planners or municipal planners or things like that, there's usually reasons as to why certain things are zoned one way or the other based on capacity, noise amounts, keeping, like a sense of separation between residential and commercial spaces, things like that. But also there are times when, say, you needed to have a property potentially rezoned or considering rezoning, it might be worth reaching out to whatever municipal office or the reserve office to see if there are ways to maybe change the zoning classification or adjust the zoning classification. And a lot of the time that is kind of there's not like a set process. Like say you were here in North Bay, we have to technically check with the council, and then council, if they approve a rezoning, has to actually check with all the people in the surrounding area if there are residential spaces, and actually ask if there are any potential issues that they see that they're not considering, just to make sure that if that business was to open up in that area where normally that type of business wouldn't have been able to open up in that area before, is it going to disturb anybody? And if the answer is no, then they're good to rezone it. Intellectual property is the last thing I'm going to touch on here. So this is if you are looking to legally protect anything that you are creating. So that could be trademarking, which is like protecting a logo. This could be patents, which is like protecting a process or an iteration or an innovation on an existing process, or also an existing like use case for a type of physical good. Copyright is the protection of a created work, whether it be like a book or a novel or a movie or a film or a type of like painting even, or a graphic designed like a graphic designed like asset of some kind. Industrial design is actually a protection of a specific type of look for an existing like say there was a patent that's now expired that has, you want to protect just a different look based on that similar use. That's a very vague way of saying it, but for example, cars are technically, like, the concept of a car, like a traditional car, is not patentable because there are, for the sake of competition, there are many different types of make and models that are available when it comes to purchasing a car. But to make a car with the same design as a Porsche or the same design as like a Mini Cooper or something like that, those actually have industrial design protections where that body shape or those like unique aspects to the design of the car, even though it's not a patented product, you can't make it look the same way. And then trade secrets is a form of intellectual property that's not actually legally protected in any way. It's just a form to keep people tight-lipped when it comes to your processes or your products or your ideas. And the way to potentially protect around trade secrets would be something like non-disclosure agreements or non-compete clauses. These are obviously like legal agreements, so I would make sure that if for some reason you did have to have someone sign NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, that you would consult a lawyer in the document to make sure that there wasn't any potential loopholes in when you're sharing this information with someone who might have the capacity to use that against you in a business like competitive nature, that you are fully protected. So back to trademarks in a bit more detail. These are things that are used to differentiate your product or service from other companies. So this could be like words, designs, even like different textures and tastes, moving images. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but you can see kind of the different differentiating aspects of what would make a trademark unique. And this actually prevents other people from using that same trademark. So like, no one else could use the golden arches, obviously, from McDonald's, because it is definitely trademarked in that unique way that it's drawn. That font, all that is definitely protected by trademarks in most likely every country that they operate in. Domestic protection is basically all that would be done through the Canadian Intellectual Property Office. If you were to file a trademark here in Canada, for example, you would only have the trademark protected in Canada. So you'd actually have to file for whatever the trademark process is in every country that you plan to operate in. So if you were looking to maybe make a business that ends up being North America wide, then you'd want to make sure that you look up how to trademark not only in Canada, but also in Central America, Mexico, and the United States. So that R that you see is used when a trademark has been registered. So that means it's registered, but it hasn't been, so it's actually like submitted to whatever governing body handles trademarks. And then TM is used when the trademark has not been registered. So you'd actually want to make sure that technically the TM, like, while it's a form of protection you can use to potentially deter someone from pursuing, people who actually know what they're doing when it comes to intellectual property law know that you want to make sure that it's the registered version, like the R with the circle around it. That's when it's actually been registered with the governing body and is fully protected. So patents are ways to protect anything that is a useful and non-obvious invention of some kind. So this could be product processes, machines, even types of chemical compositions or improvements to an existing formula of some kind, or even an existing patent that you have been able to add some external elements to create new uses for. It allows you legal rights to prevent others from kind of making, using, or selling your invention. So you can send cease and desist to individuals that are trying to do the same thing you're doing if you have that process or composition protected in some way. It also allows you the ability to license out your patent as well if you have protection on something and you know that someone else, another company, has the capacity to make that patent on a more large scale capacity, then you would be able to with the help of like an IP lawyer, sell the licensing rights, where they would pay you a fee, either in royalty or lump sum, and then they would start manufacturing and be able to sell and distribute, and you would be still generating revenue on the patent that you legally own. This is protected up to 20 years from the date of filing, and that's the same in America and Canada as well. If you want a patent, you want to definitely consider hiring a patent agent, because the documents that they file, as you can see in terms of like how defined they are, it is very complex and written in like, I'm going to call it legalese. It's a lot of very strict legal terms to make sure that everything that you are trying to protect is 100% ironclad to avoid anyone from copying you in any way. So copyright is, like I was saying, the creation or the protection of any original literary, artistic, musical, or dramatic work of some kind. This could even be things like creating a software or sound recording or photograph or painting. Even, you know, specific like computer code is even like eligible for copyright, and it prevents others from reproducing your work without the expressed written consent, and it's actually internationally protected in terms of how you don't have to technically file it in every single country, but the problem with copyright is it's actually just assumed as soon as the work is created, you can put the C next to it and put the owner's name and the year of creation and say all rights reserved, and it is copyrighted. But you should actually also register it with the Canadian Intellectual Property Office, because then that adds now proof that your name is attached to that work. So then if anyone was to replicate it or use it without your will, then you'd have legal precedent to say, hey, I not only created this on this day, I even filed it with my governing body, which adds a bit more credibility, as opposed to, you know, technically someone could forge documents or try to forge documents to say that they actually copyrighted your work earlier than you, but you would have like codified proof. Industrial design, so yeah, like I was saying here, like the Mini Cooper, it's a specific visual feature of a product, so it has nothing to do with its actual use, but it's more about the shapes, the configurations, the patterns that are used, any combination of these features in any way, and it can protect it for up to 15 years. And it is also, like the others, only protected in the specific country, so you'd have to file industrial design patents in every country that you plan to operate or sell your specific product in. And then trade secrets. So this is, like I was saying, confidential and valuable business information. So this could be like a specific business method, a type of technique that you use when manufacturing or producing something, a recipe, a formula, anything like that. So there's no formal rights. So you actually do need to use, like I said, the non-disclosure agreement or legal contracts if you were to try to protect it, if you needed to share this information with anybody. It is obviously internationally protected because it's, you know, only a select few people internally to the company probably have an understanding of what, you know, the recipe or the formula or the technique is. And the enforcing of a trade secret is 100% on the owner. It's all internal. So like, you know, the 23 unique flavors of Dr. Pepper is technically not a public document. There's people who have tried their best to guess it, but we'll never know, because they keep that locked down. And it's the same with the herbs and spices of KFC. People try to guess what they are, and they can probably come pretty darn close, but they will never, unless they are the CEO of KFC or the people very specifically manufacturing and product testing whatever their products are going to be, are not going to be able to know what the exact recipe is. So this is just a link to the Canadian Intellectual Property Office. If you just Google CIPO or the Canadian Intellectual Property Office, you will be able to find them. And they've got a ton of different resources. They've got podcasts. They've got links to actually talking with an IP advisor, and you can do that. It's covered by the federal government. It doesn't cost anything to reach out to them. The main thing with an advisor, though, is just like myself, if they're talking about anything legal, it is just advice. They can't actually get into, litigation information or specifics that would then fall to an actual intellectual property lawyer. So it is good to get like general information from them, but if it starts getting a bit more specific to your circumstance and they can tell it's legal in nature, they're most likely going to suggest you reach out to an actual lawyer. But they would have, I believe, a database of lawyers that they can put you in touch with as well, so it can help you when shopping around, because intellectual property law is so specific, so it's hard to find like I don't think there's a local lawyer in our region that does intellectual property law. I think there's one guy in Huntsville, and then there's a bunch in Toronto and a bunch in Ottawa and a bunch in Montreal and things like that. So you might have to do that virtually if you were trying to figure out that situation. So are there any questions at all for me? I'll actually stop the share here and kind of go over. So if there's any questions and anyone wants to chat, we can do that. If not, we can move on and call it a day.
I think we're good in terms of questions.
Oh, there's some questions? Okay.
No, I say I think we're good.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Well,
Thank
have
you,
a great
though.
day,
Yeah,
everyone.
great
and
presentation.
Thank you so much for joining us. And Zach will have the recording if you know anyone who would be interested in this information, and he'll be putting it up on your website, right? Is that the plan?
Right now, I've been putting it on YouTube, and I have a private link that I've just been sending people, but I do intend to put it on the membership portal eventually, yes.
Okay, awesome.
Perfect. Well,
Okay.
Miigwech again, Vince.
Hey, no worries. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks,
Questions?
guys.
Have a great
Take
day,
care,
guys.
everyone. Bye-bye. Bamapi.